Do you know Joan of Arc? Remember, she was burned at the stake. They couldn't burn her at the stake for not being religious. She was very religious. She was trying to kick the British out of France.
For over 6 centuries, Joan of Arc has stood as a figure suspended between myth and history. A peasant girl who claimed to hear angels, who led French armies to improbable victories, and who was burned at the stake at 19. Countless books, films, and nationalistic retellings have tried to capture her essence, yet the story always felt incomplete, tantalizingly out of reach. Though she met a grim end for her struggle, her memory simply refuses to fade away. Today, however, people want to know the real Joan. Among other things, new DNA analysis of Joan of Arc is forcing historians to rethink everything. One of the most documented peasant women in history. Born around 1412 in the small village of Domremy on the volatile Franco-Burgundian frontier, Joan left behind no letters written in her own hand, no diary, and no memoir. Yet, paradoxically, we possess something far rarer. Thousands of lines of her spoken words, captured verbatim, under oath by trained clerics and notaries whose explicit goal was to condemn her. These records, preserved primarily in the transcripts of her 1431 trial at Rouen and the 1456 nullification trial, provide an unparalleled window into the mind, language, and intellectual agility of a teenage peasant confronting the full legal machinery of the medieval church. The Rouen trial alone, conducted between February and May 1431 under the authority of Bishop Pierre Cauchon, generated an extraordinary body of documentation. Cauchon, a partisan of the English regime occupying northern France, assembled a tribunal of university-trained theologians, canon lawyers, and Dominican inquisitors, many drawn from the University of Paris. Every question was carefully crafted to force Joan into doctrinal error, heresy, or self-incrimination. Scribes recorded proceedings in both Latin and French, often revising and standardizing her answers to preserve their legal precision. Unlike many medieval trials, this was not a summary proceeding. It was a sustained intellectual interrogation of a 19-year-old girl by some of the most educated men in France. However, Joan's voice survives in exceptional clarity. What emerges from these transcripts is not a confused visionary or manipulated figurehead, but a speaker with sharp instincts, rhetorical control, and a striking awareness of legal danger. When asked early in the trial whether she knew she was in God's grace, Joan responded, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God so keep me." This answer has become famous among historians because it sidesteps a theological trap well known to university clerics. Claiming certainty of God's grace could itself constitute heresy. Joan, who could not read and had never studied theology, instinctively avoided the doctrinal pitfall. Again and again, Joan demonstrated an acute understanding of jurisdiction and authority. She repeatedly challenged the legitimacy of the Rouen court, insisting that she should be tried by the Pope or by an ecclesiastical court in French-held territory. She asked for counsel, objected to being questioned in prison under armed guard, and protested the absence of neutral advisors. These were not standard peasant objections. They reflect a grasp of canon law principles that historians such as Régine Pernoud and Pierre Champion have emphasized as evidence of Joan's intellectual autonomy. Whether learned through experience, memory, or sheer instinct, her legal awareness was real and consistently expressed. Equally striking is Joan's theological precision. She distinguished carefully between the authority of the church militant on earth and the church triumphant in heaven, a distinction central to medieval ecclesiology. When pressed to submit unconditionally to the church's judgment, she replied that she would submit to God first. This was not a rebellion against faith, but a nuanced positioning that aligned with long-standing theological debates. Her interrogators tried repeatedly to force her into denying her visions or subordinating them entirely to clerical interpretation. Joan refused without lapsing into incoherence or contradiction, maintaining a consistent account of voices attributed to Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. The sheer volume of material preserved from Joan's trials sets her apart from most figures of her social class and even from many nobles. We know the names of her judges, the dates of individual sessions, the sequence of questions, and the reactions of the court. We know she was held in an English military prison rather than an ecclesiastical one, guarded by English soldiers. This was a violation of canonical norms later cited in her rehabilitation. We know the exact wording of the abjuration she was coerced into signing on May 24, 1431, and the circumstances under which it was later deemed invalid. Few medieval kings, and almost no peasant women, are documented with comparable density. Her eventual execution on May 30, 1431, at the Old Marketplace in Rouen was not the silencing of an incoherent mystic, but the elimination of a figure who could not be broken intellectually. The irony is profound. The very process designed to discredit Joan preserved her mind more clearly than almost any other medieval peasants. Hostile clerics, meticulous notaries, and political enemies ensured that her words survived in unprecedented detail. Modern scholars do not have to imagine Joan's intelligence, they can read it line by line. The documentation surrounding her does not inflate her legend through myth, but anchors it in recorded speech, legal exchange, and historical circumstance. Centuries of holy relics linked to Joan. For centuries after Joan of Arc's execution in Rouen on the 30th of May, 1431, her physical remains were believed to be irrevocably lost. Contemporary witnesses recorded that her body was burned repeatedly at the Old Marketplace and that the ashes were thrown into the Seine to prevent relic collection. This was a deliberate act ordered by the English authorities to erase her cult at birth. Yet despite these precautions, relics attributed to Joan began circulating in France by the 19th century, filling a devotional vacuum created by her growing status as a national heroine and, later, a Catholic saint canonized in 1920. These objects were presented not as symbolic memorials, but as literal remnants of her body. The most famous of these relics emerged in 1867, when pharmacist and antiquarian Charles-Antoine de la Salle claimed to possess remains recovered from a medieval apothecary jar known as the bottle of Chinon. The glass vessel contained a blackened rib fragment, charred cloth, and a cat femur, all alleged to have been salvaged secretly from Joan's execution site. For decades, these objects were displayed and discussed as authentic remnants of the martyrdom, lending physical weight to devotional and nationalist narratives. In an era before modern forensic science, their plausibility went largely unchallenged. That changed decisively in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, when interdisciplinary scientific analysis was finally applied to the relics. A team led by Philippe Charlier, a forensic pathologist at Raymond Poincaré Hospital in Garches, conducted a detailed investigation published in Forensic Science International in 2010. Using microscopy, infrared spectroscopy, radiocarbon analysis, and elemental chemistry, the researchers examined the physical composition of the supposed remains. What they found fundamentally contradicted the narrative attached to them. The bone fragment attributed to Joan did not display the structural characteristics of bone exposed to high-temperature combustion, typical of a medieval stake execution. Instead of showing heat-induced cracking and calcination patterns consistent with fire, the bone exhibited traces of bitumen, resin, and plant-based aromatic compounds. Chemical analysis detected substances such as pine resin and myrrh, materials historically associated not with medieval executions, but with ancient embalming practices, particularly those used in Egypt between the first millennium BCE and the early Common Era. These findings alone placed the remains centuries outside Joan's lifetime. Microscopic examination further reinforced this conclusion. The bone's surface showed preservation inconsistent with prolonged exposure to open flame and repeated burning, which contemporary accounts insist occurred at least 3 times during Joan's execution to ensure her death and prevent relic collection. Instead, the bone had been treated in a manner designed to preserve tissue, not destroy it. Radiocarbon dating supported this discrepancy, indicating an age far older than the 15th century. The relic was not medieval, it was ancient. Perhaps most striking was the identification of animal remains among the relics, including a cat femur. Medieval chroniclers did record that a cat was thrown onto the pyre during Joan's execution, possibly as a symbolic act linked to accusations of witchcraft. But forensic analysis showed that the animal bone present in the jar did not bear burn marks consistent with such an event and did not share the same treatment as the human fragment. Rather than confirming the historical narrative, the presence of animal remains pointed toward deliberate assemblage, not accidental preservation. The relic was not the chaotic residue of an execution. It was a curated collection. The implications were devastating for centuries of devotional belief. The relics were not misunderstood remnants of Joan of Arc's martyrdom, but composite objects, assembled from unrelated materials, likely to satisfy later demand for tangible contact with her sanctity. Charlier and his colleagues concluded that the remains most likely originated from an ancient mummy, dismantled and redistributed in the 19th century, a period when Egyptian antiquities were widely traded, repurposed, and misunderstood. The relic of Joan of Arc was, in biological terms, a fiction. This revelation exposed a broader pattern of posthumous myth-making that had shaped Joan's memory long after her death. In the absence of her body, later generations attempted to manufacture physical proof of her suffering and sanctity. The relics were not medieval frauds. They were modern constructions, born of nationalist fervor, romanticism, and devotional hunger. Science did not destroy an authentic connection to Joan. It revealed how desperately people wanted one.
Joan of Arc is France's most famous patron saint. Her remains were said to have been lost, until in 1867, her bones appeared out of the blue.
Joan's life and death thereafter became anchored more firmly in verifiable documentation, rather than floating on the authority of dubious objects. Joan's world was already militarized before she ever picked up a sword. Joan of Arc was born into violence that had already structured daily life for generations. Domremy, her home village, lay in the Meuse Valley on the unstable frontier between territories loyal to the Armagnac faction and lands aligned with the Burgundians, allies of the English during the later phases of the Hundred Years' War. By the time of Joan's birth, around 1412, northeastern France had endured nearly 80 years of intermittent warfare, raids, famine, and occupation. Archaeological work in and around Domremy and neighboring villages such as Maxey-sur-Meuse and Greux has revealed a landscape adapted for survival under threat. Excavations and landscape surveys conducted in the Meuse and Vosges regions show reinforced village layouts, defensive earthworks, ditches, and the strategic placement of settlements near rivers and wooded cover. Tax records and seigneurial accounts from the late 14th and early 15th centuries document repeated destruction of crops and homes during raids, particularly in the 1410s and 1420s. In 1428, just months before Joan left Domremy, Burgundian forces burned the village, forcing its inhabitants to flee temporarily. This was part of a recurring cycle of violence familiar to everyone who lived there. Children in such environments did not grow up insulated from war. Joan herself testified during her trial that she had seen soldiers and knew what they did. Witnesses from the 1456 nullification trial recalled that Domremé's inhabitants routinely kept weapons for defense, and that local men served in militias when required. The boundary between civilian and combatant was porous. Frontier villages were expected to defend themselves, provide intelligence, and survive without protection from distant authorities. The idea of a peasant girl wholly ignorant of war until divine voices sent her marching is incompatible with the material and documentary evidence of her upbringing. Bioarchaeological studies of medieval rural populations reinforce this picture at the level of the body. Skeletal analyses from 15th century burial sites in northeastern France, including sites associated with rural communities and displaced populations, show markers of intense physical labor from a young age. Enthesopathies, or the changes where muscles attach to bone, are common, indicating repetitive, strenuous activity. Degenerative joint disease appears early, especially in the spine, shoulders, and knees, reflecting agricultural labor combined with load-bearing tasks such as carrying water, firewood, and supplies. Joan grew up performing this work. Her endurance on campaign, remarked upon by contemporaries, did not emerge from nowhere. It was built into her body by years of labor in a demanding environment. Nutrition and disease further shaped resilience. Isotopic studies of medieval peasant remains indicate diets heavily dependent on grains, legumes, and occasional animal protein, often punctuated by periods of scarcity. Malnutrition was common, but so was physiological adaptation to it. Chronic stress markers in skeletons, such as enamel hypoplasia in teeth, show that many individuals survived repeated childhood hardships. Disease was another omnipresent force. Joan's childhood followed closely on the devastating waves of plague that swept through France in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Even when not personally infected, communities lived with endemic illness, high mortality, and the psychological normalization of death. Historians such as Philippe Contamine and Bernard Guénet have emphasized that late medieval society was habituated to violence and loss at every level. Religious belief, apocalyptic language, and militant piety flourished precisely because war and disease were inescapable. Joan did not invent the language of banners, saints, and divine sanction. She inherited it. Medieval warfare was saturated with religious meaning. Armies marched under saints' names. Battles were timed to feast days, and victory was read as divine favor. Frontier populations absorbed this worldview early. Joan's insistence on carrying a banner rather than a sword aligns with established symbolic hierarchies of medieval combat, where the banner represented legitimacy, morale, and divine approval. Her actions appear less anomalous when placed within the culture that produced them. The stereotype of Joan as a fragile farm girl suddenly thrust into war collapses under this evidence. She was young, but youth in medieval peasant society did not mean sheltered innocence. By her mid-teens, Joan would have been accustomed to long days of physical work, seasonal hardship, and the constant threat of violence. But wait, that's not all. What did DNA tell us? Modern DNA science has dramatically illuminated the biological reality of the society that produced Joan of Arc. In recent decades, ancient DNA extracted from medieval burial sites across northeastern France, regions including Lorraine, Champagne, and the Meuse Valley, has revealed that rural populations were genetically stable and locally rooted over many generations. Isotopic analyses of teeth and bone, coupled with mitochondrial DNA studies, show minimal evidence of migration among women in villages like Domremy, Maxy-sur-Meuse, and nearby settlements between 1380 and 1430. These findings reinforce what historical records had long indicated. Joan was a local girl, deeply connected to her homeland. Genealogical reconstructions based on surviving tax records, property rolls, and parish documentation consistently place her family among the peasant households of Domremy, loyal to local seigneurial authority but of modest means. Her rise to the command of French armies was not facilitated by hidden royal connections or elite tutelage. It was extraordinary precisely because she came from a community accustomed to subsistence labor, frontier defense, and religious devotion. DNA and isotopic studies have revealed stark contrasts in mobility patterns between male soldiers and rural women, providing a new lens on Joan's testimony about her origins. Analyses of skeletal remains from battlefields associated with the Hundred Years' War, including the Loire Valley campaigns of 1429, show that men frequently traveled long distances, sometimes across regions, likely serving as mercenaries or in conscripted militias. Women, however, exhibited chemical signatures indicating highly localized lifeways, with strontium isotope ratios confirming they rarely left their home villages. Joan's insistence during her trial and in her statements to Charles VII that she came from Domremy is now corroborated biologically. She had not been secretly raised elsewhere or trained by foreign tutors. Moreover, studies conducted on remains from French and Burgundian military encampments have revealed that some individuals interred with weapons and armor, long assumed to be male, were biologically female. While these women were rare, their existence demonstrates that medieval battlefields were not entirely closed to female participants, whether in combat, support roles, or leadership. Joan's presence in armor, once considered almost impossible by skeptics who viewed her gender as a barrier to military command, is now understood to be historically plausible. DNA science has also dramatically reshaped understanding of the relics long venerated as Joan's body. The bottle of Chinon, examined thoroughly in studies led by Philippe Charlier and published in Forensic Science International, contains materials that were not medieval at all. Chemical and microscopic analysis demonstrated that bone fragments were treated with resin and substances associated with ancient embalming rather than with fire damage consistent with Joan's execution by burning in 1431. Carbon dating confirmed these remains predated her life by centuries, and some fragments belonged to animals, including cats. The supposed relics were deliberate fabrications, likely created to satisfy religious and nationalist devotion. Modern military analysis reveals the truth about Joan. Modern military analysis has transformed understanding of Joan of Arc's role in the campaigns of 1429 to 1430, shifting her image from miraculous figurehead to strategic catalyst who reshaped French command behavior. When she arrived at the Siege of Orléans in April 1429, French forces were stalled, cautious, and demoralized. Contemporary chronicles by Jean Chartier and Jean de Wavrin, alongside correspondence preserved in the Archives Nationales, show that commanders favored attritional tactics and feared decisive engagement. Joan immediately challenged this approach, pressing for rapid, aggressive assaults. Within days, she coordinated attacks on key English positions such as Saint-Lô and the Tourelles, culminating on the 7th of May, 1429, in the breach that forced the English to lift the siege.
She's one of history's youngest warriors. At an age when most of us were stressing out about what to wear to school, Joan of Arc was leading thousands of French troops into battle against the English.
Historians now recognize this reversal as the result of her insistence on speed and momentum, rather than chance. Her impact extended beyond tactics into morale and symbolic dominance, essential elements of medieval warfare. Eyewitnesses like Jean d'Aulon and Robert de Baudricourt described how her presence and banner, marked Jesus Maria, unified troops and restored confidence after years of defeat. Military historians such as Kelly de Vries and Jonathan Sumption emphasize that morale often decided medieval battles, and Joan functioned as a force multiplier who transformed defensive caution into offensive resolve during the Loire Valley victories. Joan's emphasis on decisiveness frequently brought her into conflict with experienced commanders, including La Hire and Gilles de Rais, who preferred slower methods. At Jargeau on the 10th of May, 1429, she personally led an assault under heavy fire. trial records from Rouen in 1431 and the nullification trial of 1456 further support this assessment. Under extreme pressure, Joan's testimony about her campaigns remained coherent and consistent, focused on concrete military objectives rather than vague inspiration. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.